Hi everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our series called Isa Kenegdu. If you missed the first one, then you missed Josie explaining what Isa Kenegdu is, which is just the term that God used when he created woman. First he created man, and then he said the man will need an Isa Kenegdu, which is someone that stands boldly opposite him, and then he created a woman. And so in this series we're looking at different women in the Bible, what their story is and the significance of their lives. Today we're going to be in Genesis, so if you haven't already got a Bible in front of you, then make sure you grab one now. Now, I have a sister. She's younger than me. She's only about 22 months younger than me, so it's not a huge age gap for us. And we are totally different. So I have always been the tallest in my class. I've got dark hair. I've got green eyes. I've always been very outgoing and confident. And I played every sport possible growing up. Whereas my sister has always been the shortest in the class. Even now, she's only 5'2". She's got blonde hair, blue eyes. She was always very shy growing up, and she wasn't interested in sport at all. And to be honest, because of this, I think we got on quite well. We weren't ever competing with each other. We had different interests. We were different to look at. We couldn't share clothes. And so I think it did us a favor in our relationship, and we got on pretty well. We had some friends that were like the same age as us, Lisa and Faye. They were like our best friends. Lisa was my age. Faye was my sister's age. And they were so similar. They were exactly the same size growing up, always, the same height. They were into the same things, and they fought constantly over clothes, over jewelry, over makeup, over boys. If one of them had something, the other wanted it. So I wonder, do you have siblings? What was it like growing up for you? What were your relationships with your siblings? Or if not siblings, then maybe close friends or cousins that you kind of counted as family. Or if you didn't have any of that, what was that like if you grew up as an only child? We'll chat a bit more about that later. So today we're looking at the story of a sister, and her name is Leah. She is not the main character of a story. She doesn't have a book named after her like Ruth or Esther. She's mentioned a few times in Genesis and once again in the book of Ruth. So get your Bibles ready in Genesis 29, and we're going to read that together in a minute. Now, Leah actually features in Jacob's story. And so for us to really understand Leah and the context of what happens to her, we really need to look at Jacob first. So his story starts in Genesis 25, just as Abraham's story ends. Now, Abraham, of course, is considered to be the father of faith. He had a son, Isaac, who he was willing to sacrifice to be obedient to God. He took him up on a mountainside. He laid him on an altar. He was ready to make that sacrifice until God stopped him. Isaac then grew up and he married Rebecca, and Rebecca became pregnant with twins. And while Rebecca was pregnant, the twins were fighting inside of her. And it's shown in the Bible that she said, oh, if it's going to be like this, I'm not sure I want to be pregnant. Honestly, as someone that's been pregnant myself, I've had that very thought. And I didn't have twins. And then the Lord told her that she had two nations in her womb, two people groups will be separated from within her. And so, I mean, that's not particularly reassuring, is it? As she's sort of complaining about these twins that are fighting, God's basically saying they're always going to fight. So these twin boys were born. The first is described as reddish all over, like a hairy garment, which is a really interesting description for a baby. Not a particularly pleasant description. And they called him Esau. And the second baby came out holding the heel of his brother, and that was Jacob. So Jacob, who was favored by his mother Rebekah, deceived Esau out of his birthright by exploiting Esau's hunger. So basically, Jacob, the secondborn, was not set to inherit the same amount as Esau would. The firstborn would always inherit more. But with his mother's help, he tricked his brothers so that he could get that firstborn right. That meant he tricked his father as well into receiving a blessing from his father. And he did that by disguising himself as Esau. So this was terrible, and this deceit led to years of estrangement and animosity. Esau therefore hated Jacob, and he was planning on killing him. So their mother Rebekah told Jacob to run away. She had a brother called Laban who lived far away, and Isaac, the father, told him to go there and find a wife in one of Laban's daughters. So basically the mission was travel a really long way, go and find Laban, and he has daughters and you should marry one of them. Which obviously in our culture, that's a really strange mission, but that was culturally appropriate back then. So Jacob set off to meet his uncle and a future wife, hopefully. So why don't you open your Bibles if you haven't already, and we're going to read from Genesis 29, starting at verse 10. So it says, when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. So Rachel is working for her father. She's Laban's second daughter, and she's looking after the sheep, and Jacob turns up and goes and helps, basically. Then verse 11 says, Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. I don't think this was a romantic kiss. I think this was a family kiss, and the weeping was basically the relief. It was a really, really long journey. It had taken ages to get there. Without sat-nav or maps or anything. He was never 100% sure where he was going. And in meeting Rachel, he realized that he had come to Laban's land, and he was just relieved to arrive and to meet his cousin. Verse 12, he says he had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. So it was custom at the time to greet family members like this. Laban had perhaps never met Jacob, had only heard about him. And so he was excited to meet his nephew, his sister's son. But Jacob was also from a rich family, and Laban was a farmer. So there's a difference in their wealth, and Laban would potentially have seen this as a bit of an opportunity. And Laban said, you are my own flesh and blood. So after Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. So Jacob, being from a fairly wealthy family, he would have always had servants, and he wouldn't necessarily have done any manual work himself, any farming, tending to the animals, any of that sort of stuff. So Laban is asking this question kind of to see what sort of a man is he? Is he going to do some work? Is he going to show up, or is he just going to be sort of continue to be treated as a rich person? Now, Laban had two daughters, and the name of the older one was Leah, and the name of the younger one was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. So finally, we get to meet Leah, who we're talking about today. And she is the older sister, and she is just simply described as having weak eyes. Now, the Hebrew word used here is rakot, which means tender or gentle. So there's a few different ways this could be interpreted. Some people think it means that she potentially had poor eyesight. Maybe she was partially sighted or had a squint or something like that. Or it could mean that her eyes were dull that because she's being compared to Rachel, who's being described as beautiful, it might just mean that Rachel had really beautiful, bright eyes and Leah didn't. Now, there's a really good chance here that Leah and Rachel were twins as well. Remember, Jacob and Esau were twins, and so there would have been twins in the family. And it might be that the writer has sort of highlighted the eyes because maybe that was like the main way that you could tell the difference between Leah and Rachel. This is all inference, so if you have a different opinion, that's totally fine. So verse 18 says Jacob was in love with Rachel, and he said, I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. So although Jacob was from a rich family, he had arrived with no money. And so a father in this situation would expect a dowry when their daughter is getting married. But obviously Jacob can't offer that. So offering 7 years work is way more generous than a normal dowry would be. So he's paying over the top for this marriage. Verse 19, Laban says, it's better that I give her to you than some other man. Lovely sentiment. Yeah, okay, I suppose you can have her, basically. He says, stay here with me. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. What a lovely romantic sentiment. 7 years only feeling like a few days. So then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed and I want to make love for her. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. So they wouldn't have had like a wedding ceremony in the way that we have a wedding ceremony now. It wasn't necessarily like a legal process as we do. It's a community event. The whole community comes together, celebrates with a big party, and then the wedding night is when the covenant between the man and the woman happens. So that's really when they become married, in that wedding night. And then in verse 23 it says, but when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. So somehow a swap is done here. Jacob has worked 7 years to marry the woman he loves, but he is now being tricked into marrying the other sister. Now, there's probably some really obvious questions, which you can definitely discuss later, around how Jacob didn't know that it was Leah and not Rachel who came into the bedroom before he made love for her. To her. But if they were twins, then it would probably have been fairly easy to do just by using a veil to cover Leah's face, having them wear the same clothes. There's also a really good chance that a whole day of feasting, Jacob would have had some wine, a significant amount of wine, who knows. And so perhaps his brain was a little foggy, not as clear by the time he reached the evening. We don't have the details. We can only guess as to how the trickery was done, but ultimately Jacob slept with Leah that night, and therefore she officially became his wife and not Rachel. And it says in verse 24, and Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? And Laban replied, it is not our custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, and then we will give you the younger one in return for another 7 years' work. So Laban justifies his actions by saying the older daughter should always get married first, and so that's why he's done it. But says you can also marry Rachel, but you need to do another 7 years for Rachel. So he's totally exploiting Jacob here. And what choice has Jacob got at this point? He can't walk away. He's married and he's got duties to fulfill with Leah. He's got nowhere else to go. He's got no money, and he loves Rachel. And so what choice has he got but to agree to this? And in verse 28, it says, and Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. And then Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban for another 7 years. So he was allowed to marry Rachel first this time, and then work the next 7 years. He didn't have to wait 7 years before he could marry Rachel, but he still had to do that duty of 7 years. So then verse 31 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. So this is where we get to see a little bit more of Leah's story. She is stuck in a marriage where she isn't loved. And in fact, the original Hebrew might be closer to the word hated. So it's not just that she's unloved, but that Jacob hates Leah because of what's happened. She was really miserable. She wasn't valued. And she was stuck with someone that not only hated her, but was in love with someone else. And that someone else was her sister. And then it says, God saw this and gave her a son, Reuben, and he's named Reuben because the Lord has seen her misery. So there's a link in the name and her spiritual journey there. Then it says, she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. Again, she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, now at last my husband will become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. And so he was named Levi. And then finally, in verse 35, she conceived again. And when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah. And then she stopped having children. So just a quick summary of what happens next. Jacob then becomes annoyed that Rachel hasn't produced a son. So Rachel offers her servant or her handmaid instead. And that was successful. And she had Dan and Naphtali. Then Leah offered her handmaid to produce more children, and she had Gad and Asher. And then Leah then actually got pregnant again and had 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally Rachel became pregnant and had her own sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Girls were also born, but only one is mentioned, and that's Dinah. So Jacob had 12 sons in total, and they later became the 12 tribes of Israel. But back to Leah. Leah's life, or certainly the part that we have seen, is one of suffering. She named her firstborn Reuben because the Lord has looked with pity on the oppressed condition. Her second son was Simeon because the Lord heard that I was unloved. She's deeply saddened by being in this marriage where she's got no value and no respect, but God sees her. And this story reminds me of the story of Mary and Martha in Luke 10. They also were 2 sisters, and their brother was Lazarus, and they were friends with Jesus. And one day Jesus and his disciples had arrived at their house as they passed through their town. And Martha, the older sister like Leah, was running around doing all the work. She was stressing about everything. She was trying to tidy up. She was trying to make space for everyone, while Mary, like Rachel, just sat at the feet of Jesus with the men. And Martha was really frustrated, and she asked Jesus to send Mary to help. But Jesus replied, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few are needed, or indeed only one. And in that moment, Jesus saw Martha. The fact that Jesus says her name twice is one of endearment. He loves her. He sees her. He knows what she is doing, and he names it. He says, you are worried about many things, but few are needed. He sees that she is stressing about things like the state of the house, the dust, the lack of fancy food, all these things that she doesn't need to worry about. He doesn't want her to worry about them. They don't matter. And so he invites her to come and sit with him. And whether you are male or female, there is something in both Leah's story and Martha's story that we can all relate to around not being seen, not feeling loved, not feeling wanted, not knowing where our place is in the world. However, my desire to be inclusive to men means that I'm at risk of not honouring women in particular who feel like this a lot of the time. I'm not talking about being in a loveless marriage, but being unseen. So I just want to take a minute to address that. But men, please don't switch off or feel like I'm excluding you. I do know that men can feel like this too. It's just my experience is that Leah's story unlocks something that pretty much every woman I know can relate to. The unseen, the things that are done that are not noticed or valued. I have observed even in just social situations where everyone is hanging out and having fun, but something needs to be done, whether it's drinks need to be made or washing up needs to be done. There's some sort of job. And so often it is the women that just automatically do it. Nobody asks them. Nobody assumes that they're going to do it, but they just automatically do it. The unseen jobs. Again, sometimes it's men that do it. It's never just a one-way situation. So many times since having kids, Luke will think about making dinner and will say, "Oh, are there any ideas for dinner? What's for dinner?" But I've thought about it several hours ago, maybe even several days ago. I've made sure that we've got what we need in the fridge. I've maybe designed an alternative dish for the child that doesn't eat sauces. I've turned the oven on. I've prepped the veg. We're already underway by the time Luke is just wondering what it might be. Now, once again, I know couples where this happens, but the roles are reversed and it's the men that are carrying that mental load and doing the unseen. But mostly, in my experience, it's women. And this isn't me doing a little bit of men bashing or bringing a feminist agenda. That really isn't my thing at all. I'm not even trying to make a comment on whether that's okay, or I'm not trying to say men need to do more or women should do less. I'm not bringing any level of judgment. I'm simply observing that in this story, Leah is unseen and unvalued and unloved. And in Martha's story, she's doing all this stuff that is unseen. And even in our society today, women are not valued in the same way as men. The gifts they have, the things that they bring, they're not seen as worth the same as what men bring. But the Lord saw Leah. He saw that she was not loved. He saw her quiet pain. And so he blessed her with a child. He blessed her with love. And we can learn so much about God's character from this. He's compassionate. He's attentive. He sees Leah. He really sees her and blesses her. He's a provider. He provides for her in this situation, ensuring she is the mother of the firstborn son who has firstborn rights. He is faithful to his promises because God promised Abraham, who's Jacob's grandfather, many descendants. And through Leah and the other 3 women, the 12 tribes of Israel are born. It's significant that Leah has the son that's called Judah, because the tribe of Judah eventually becomes the Jews, and Jesus was born a Jew. Therefore, Jesus was a direct descendant of Leah. She is a great-great-grandmother. Great, probably lots of greats, but she's a great-great-grandmother of Jesus. Without Leah, we wouldn't have Jesus. And through Leah, great things were done, most of which she never saw. She suffered deeply, but it wasn't for nothing. It just wasn't for her own benefit. She might have been unseen by the people around her, her own father, who thought she'd never get married, her husband, her sister. But God saw her. So, time for some discussion now. I've got a few questions for you, which are going to come on the screen, but feel free to choose just 1 or 2 if you want. The first one, for a starter, do you have siblings? What was your relationship growing up with them? Or if not, close friends or cousins? Or if not, what was it like growing up as an only child? Have you seen God use difficult or unfair situations in your life to bring about a greater purpose? Or are there difficult or unfair situations that you're praying will bring about a greater purpose? Can you share an example of a challenging time, maybe turning into blessing? Leah named each of her children in ways that reflected her spiritual journey. Now, if you had a child right now and you had to name him or her as a reflection of your relationship with God, what would you name them? You might want to take a little pause to think about that, or maybe write that down before you share it. And finally, Leah's story shows that God values and uses those who feel unseen. How can we, as a community, ensure that we see and value those who might feel overlooked among us. Over to you.